I love Hollow Knight. This is not a secret. And like most Hollow Knight lovers, I am eagerly anticipating the release of its sequel, Silksong. But alas, there has been no news, at least not recently. So, as my personal form of rain dance or possibly just copium, I'm going to sculpt Hornet, who is the player character in Silksong, in case you didn't know. But this is me we're talking about. I'm not gonna just do it normal. Instead, I'm going to reimagine Hornet as human. Why? I don't know, it seems like a cool idea. But anyway, here we go. We've got a basic armature built, applied some clay, built out the skeleton to make sure our proportions are correct. Then I'm going to do a basic anatomy build-up so we can do some posing and composing. With every project, I aim to improve something in particular about my craft, and lately I feel like I've been settling on a composition a little too quickly. So this time I want to try all the variations in my mind before committing to the most interesting one. So here is the first idea. I'm making like she's kind of hopping backwards, perhaps to avoid an attack. Not bad, not great. I'm not in love with it. And here's the second one. I have her running forward at max speed, ready to slice you up with her needle, or I guess in this version, her sword. Third idea is a bit like the second, but I've turned her hip just a little bit to make like she's circling around an enemy, and I think this is a bit more interesting than the straight on version. Fourth idea, she's landing from a high jump. She does this all the time when you fight her, and it's nice and vertical, unlike the running ones. Really, really love this one. One last one, since we've looked at some really dynamic jumping and running poses, I wanted to try one where she's maybe pulling back her needle, ready to throw it at you javelin style, and to be honest, didn't like this one at all. In the end, I really did fall in love with the vertical jumping pose, so that's what I decided to go with. Which means the very first thing I had to do was to replace the aluminum armature in her landing foot with a steel wire so that it will support the whole sculpture, and then we can get into some anatomy refinements. Going with this pose was a real surprise for me. I came into this project thinking I wanted to do a running action, and I didn't have a jumping one in mind at all before I started. It really shows the importance of trying new ideas even when you think you know what you want. Sometimes, oftentimes, your first idea is not your best idea. Sometimes people ask me why I don't draw before I sculpt, and actually, this is why. I was able to test out 5 compositions in 3D in about 45 minutes, and when I was done, I have the basis for the sculpture ready to go. Anyway, here's the anatomy mostly done. I'll make a few other small adjustments off camera, but this is basically it. She's going to be mostly clothed, so I didn't want to spend too much time refining the anatomy, just the basics will do. Next, we can move on to the face. I'm going for a cutesier, small chin, big eyes look like, say, Anna de Armas, as opposed to a chiseled model look like, say, Margot Robbie. I mean, there's obviously a wider spectrum of faces than that, but I think we can all agree that the OG Hornet is cute. Also, I want her to be making a grim, determined expression. I think Hornet would be quite a serious person, and I think she would not be making goofy faces in the middle of combat. Once the face is done, we can transfer it over to the body so we can work on her hair. I like doing hair on the body because the transplant can be difficult if you do it after. Okay, so Hornet has 2 huge horns, and I didn't want to give her like a silly looking helmet or a Hornet mask or something. She's Hornet, not a Hornet cosplayer, so I went with pigtails. To be honest, this was my plan all along and why I wanted to put her in a dynamic, high-speed action that would send the pigtails flying backwards in an emulation of her cartoon horns. Of course, I know that if she's just standing around, the tails wouldn't be flying up like this, so the dynamic movement is technically a cheat to get the look, but I don't care, I like it anyway. I decided to give her bangs because it broke up the visuals in a nice way and I thought it was cute. But also, it made her look a bit more like Harley Quinn, so she ended up looking a bit like Margot Robbie after all. Oh well, at least it looks nice. And that's the face and anatomy. For her costume, I want to put her in very form-fitting pants, so all these little lumps and bumps that I didn't even out during the anatomy sculpting are going to have to be smoothed out. And since this piece is done largely in polymer clay, I can bake the whole sculpture hard and sand it smooth. This is a really fast way of evening out large, smooth areas in a sculpture. I think this ended up taking like 20 minutes max. See? Smooth. Now we can go ahead and put on some clothes. In this version, I imagine Hornet to be a warrior assassin trained by her mother, Hera the Spider Queen, to be her invisible hand outside the fiefdom of Deep Nest. Now, if you don't know Hollow Knight lore, that probably sounded a little bit like gibberish to you, and if you do know Hollow Knight lore, you're probably thinking, hey, wait a minute, that's not right. And look, this is meant to be an adaptation, okay? It's not meant to be exactly like the OG Hornet, but if you feel very strongly that I deviated from the source material, you can let me know in the comments. That's what it's there for. Anyway, I want you to imagine Hera as a tyrant queen who rules an underground kingdom of cutthroats and monsters. Hera had one daughter, Hornet, who learned how to wield the family's signature weapon of iron-strong silk and killed for the sake of her mother and her fief. So, as a practical warrior assassin, I think Hornet would favor close-fitting clothing that doesn't get in the way, and mostly no armor to keep the weight low. Plus, she doesn't plan on getting hit, so why bother with armor, right? This basically means leather pants, vest, and arm guards just to keep herself from getting scratched up while running around. The shoulders remain open for freedom of movement, especially since she's going to be wearing a cloak anyway. And by the way, starting from about here, I'm really going to start to jump back and forth in time in the edit because it just makes more sense to show the same parts of the sculpture together rather than chronologically. So if you see her arm and her head missing, for example, don't worry, I will address that in just a bit. And that's the costume minus her signature cloak. I am very happy with this, but her butt area was looking a little plain, so I decided to give her a little pouch there just for some visual interest. We can't let Hornet have a plain butt now, can we? But anyway, I'm so happy with this costume that I have decided I'm going to save this work by making her cloak removable. Fair warning, this one decision is going to have some serious consequences, as you are about to see. First, I saw off the head because I want to make the cloak a one piece that comes on and off from the top. Then I apply some cause clay separator to the model. This stuff prevents two pieces of clay from bonding to each other during baking. The plan is to sculpt the initial formation of the cloak onto the model, bake it, and remove it after it has cured in the oven. Oh, yes! Can I tell you a secret? This version of the cloak was actually my second attempt. The first one failed miserably, and I was kind of running out of ideas at this point, so that the shell came off cleanly there was a big breakthrough to enable the removable cloak idea to go forward. So that's why my reaction was really strong there. Anyway, I continue to add clay to the initial form and baking it a little bit at a time, trying to keep the amount of uncured clay small. This is a new method of sculpting that I'm attempting, so I had no idea if this was going to work, and after a few passes, it was really starting to shape up. However, eventually, I had a problem. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to get a little bit technical about how all this works in order to explain. You see, polymer clays get really weak in the oven, even after it had been previously cured. And there came a point in which this whole cloak taco was structurally wonky enough that it distorted and cracked open on the inside. This damage is actually not that bad, but it was just bad enough that the cloak didn't really fit anymore. So I figured, okay, the clay needs more support, so I will give it support. Specifically in the form of Odie's Propoxy 20, which is an epoxy putty very similar to Odie's Fix-It stick that I frequently use to reinforce armatures. Except Propoxy has a higher temperature tolerance, which sounded like a good thing to me. Except I've never used this stuff before, which is an important detail that will come back to bite me in just a minute. Basically, I carve out the cracks to make some room and then cover most of the underside with Propoxy to act as armature for the clay. Then cover it with more clay so that the finish will be uniform. So far so good, right? Yeah, I thought so too, until I put the cloak in the oven and this happened. So many things went wrong with that last decision to use Propoxy. First, the part that fitted closely around her arm couldn't be reinforced, and that unreinforced clay was too weak for the heavily reinforced cloak, and it just broke. Not only that, the whole thing distorted even worse. On top of all this, it looks like Propoxy had quite a bit of moisture in it that turned into steam in the oven. All of the Propoxy that was covered in regular clay had some bubbling underneath, and it looked to have burst open around the edges. Yeah, Propoxy, as it turns out, is not appropriate for use with polymer clays, or at least not in the way that I used it. The lesson here is to always test new materials before using it on an active project. It sounds so obvious in hindsight, but I assumed that two similar products from the same company would behave similarly. I was obviously very, very wrong. So, how do I fix this? All right, well, without getting into another overly long explanation on top of an already long one, I basically peel off all the propoxy from the cloak, which was shockingly easy to do, by the way, and kind of forced the whole thing back together temporarily using CA glue, then resculpted the damaged areas using Abe's Fix-It Sculpt. Once the Abe's cures, it acts as a brace to keep the whole thing held together. The most annoying thing about this whole ordeal was knowing that all of my problems are self-created. This all happened because I wanted to make the cloak removable, then attempted to use strange, untested materials on a live project. And look, this might seem really frustrating, and it was, but the truth is, I'm doing this in an intentionally obtuse way because I'm trying to learn at the same time. I know I could have used aluminum mesh as an armature for the cloak, and I know that that would have been more stable. But generally, I find heavy armatures to be restrictive, and I wanted to know if it can be done without. I'm trying to push this clay to its limits to figure out what I can and cannot do with it. So, as frustrating as it is, I'm actually not crying about it. I'm learning. And learn I did. I learned the limits of this clay and how to fix major problems without additional baking. And now you get to watch me struggle with doing things the hard way. It's kind of a win-win. Alright, now that that's over, I'm gonna make Hornet's sword. I'm covering a steel wire with more Abe's Fix-It Sculpt, then sanding it down to shape. Epoxy clay really is the best material for this kind of task. As always, wear a respirator if you're doing this for yourself. You do not want to be breathing in epoxy dust. I cannot repeat that enough times. Once the blade has been shaped, it's time to connect it to the arm, which we are going to saw off to make it fit in the oven. With the sword attached, the piece is like 22 inches tall, and that's way too big for my dinky home oven. It also makes the attachment process much more manageable. Trying to do this in mid-air with the arm on the body is much, much more difficult. I know because I tried. The way this works is I connect the sword to the arm and roughed in the shape of the hand using more Aves, then covered up the epoxy clay with regular polymer clay to finish. It's not necessary to cover Aves with polymer clay, I'm just better with polymer clay, so it's just easier for me to do fine details with it. And we are going to add the silk threads to her sword hilt later, but we're going to skip that for now because the best time to do that is after painting in the final assembly. While we're dealing with the arm, I did notice that there's something strange going on with the way the shoulder and the neck is set. The shoulder is way too low and far out, and the neck is way, way, way too long. It should be more like this. Now, looking back at the anatomy stage, the problem definitely existed before, but it's nowhere near how weird it looks now. So I think this is an accident resulting from making the head and the arm removable. Somehow, extra material got added and the neck was extended and the shoulder got lowered and moved out. Unfortunately, it is too late to do a real anatomy fix now, but I'm still going to try and do what I can by adding some mass to the shoulder to lift it, shortening the neck, and expanding the collar a bit to help sell the effect. It's not a perfect fit, but it is better than it was before. But with that, the sculpting is complete. Looks kind of like a mess with all those fixes to the cloak, right? Here's how she looks with a coat of primer on. Not bad, huh? I really dig some of the lines here, especially from this front angle. Plus, I learned a lot about how to separate a sculpture into parts and how to fix major damage issues, and both of those are surely going to come in handy in the future. Anyway, I'm quite happy with this, so we can move on to the painting. But before we do that, hi, hello there, it's me, Art, the guy with the sculpting and whatnot. Look, if you've watched the video up until this point, or you've seen any other of my videos, you know what I'm about. I'm an artist, I take my work very seriously, and I continuously push myself to be better. But to speak frankly, I could use some help. It takes an immense amount of time and effort to put one of these videos and one of these projects together, and I would be grateful for some support. Which is why I've launched a Patreon page where you can do exactly that. Patreon, in case you didn't know, is a platform where you can directly support creators you love. In my case, I've got some extra content for you. I will be posting work-in-progress updates on future projects and extended commentaries on existing projects, including this one. And if you're interested in getting started sculpting yourself, I have posted a 3-hour, 6-part real-time sculpt-along tutorial on how to build a proportional figure just like these guys over here. These are absolutely fundamental to the way I sculpt. I've had a lot of people ask me, how do I get started sculpting? And the long answer to that question is this. This is it right here. Learning how to do one of these proportional figures is going to put you on your way towards completing your first sculpture. All that and of course more Patreon exclusive content to come in the future, and Discord access where I will be hanging out, chit-chatting, talking about all things art and sculpture and whatever. And if those perks and rewards sound interesting to you, please do check out patreon.com/artchongart. I will be ever so grateful. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your consideration. Once again, that's patreon.com/artchongart. Link is in the description below. Thank you so much once again, and now back to the sculpture. Okay, first I'm going to recess shade the body so that I don't miss any small nook or cranny. If you just spray straight on, it's really easy to miss some small recessed area, and I really want to make sure they're all filled in this particular case. Now, if you're a painter, you might be wondering why I didn't just prime the model black to begin with. Wouldn't that be more convenient? And that's a good question. The reason is because I use the priming stage as a final check to see if there are any bumps or bruises that I want to clean up before painting. Since I use sandable primer, I can make any final adjustments needed there, and it would have been a lot harder to detect blemishes with black primer instead of gray. Now, once I've got the model base coated black, I'm going to start highlighting up slowly with thin layers of gray. Painting black is, to my mind, one of the harder things to paint because black is the darkest color you have, right? So how do you shade it? You can't. All you can do is highlight. And anything you choose to highlight with is going to be not black. So it's a constant challenge to figure out what is the right amount of highlighting while maintaining a suitably dark tone. After the initial highlights, I picked out some of the edges with a lighter gray. I want her clothes to look a touch worn at the edges, like she's been through some adventures in them, so I felt like this was an important thing to include even though it was a pain in the ass to do. Next, I picked out all the buttons in her costumes a nice bright silver and did her pouch in dark brown just for a little splash of color. After all that's done, I decided that the whole thing was just a little too light and was starting to read like dark gray or even navy, so I doused the whole model in the black oil wash. This was super scary to do because it felt like I could have just undone all the work that I did so far, but it turned out quite well. Maybe it's a touch too dark, but I'd rather it be too dark than too light, given the two choices. Right about now is when I'm extremely happy I took the time to make the cloak removable, because it was hella easy to paint now that I didn't have to worry about the rest of the model. I shade the underside a dark burgundy and pre-shade the recesses of the cloak on top. In this case, it's not just about the coverage, but rather I'm actually shading where the shadows on the cloak would be. And you'll see why in a second when I coat the whole thing in this nice vibrant layer of red. And you can see that since the red is quite transparent, it automatically blended with the recess shading to give me some nice shading across the entire piece. I decided to go with a vibrant red to follow some of the Silksong art that's been released, even though in-game it's more of a blood red, just because it seemed like a bolder, more interesting choice. And that's it for the cloak. Now I just set this aside while I work on the rest of the model. Which brings me to the sword. I already painted the arm along with the body, so now I just have to work on the weapon itself. I tried to do some pre-shading along the blade the same way I did the cloak, but this didn't really work at all, because the silver that I chose for the top layer was too opaque. In fact, metallics in general are really opaque, so it just covered up all the shading that I did. I should have tested this first. I'm still not really learning my lessons, it seems, but I didn't mind the straight up silver sword, so I just left it as is and moved on to the wraps on the handle. This is just some white with a gray wash. Her weapon reads as pretty much all white in game, and I wanted to stick with that to contrast with the body and match her face and hair, which we are going to work on next. For the face, I first put down a layer of reddish purple. That's because I wanted to do a very pale skin tone, and I felt like purple might make an interesting undertone. It's a subtle thing, but when you paint with an airbrush, almost every color is a little transparent, so layering does have an effect. That said, I probably went a little overboard with the skin tone coverage. If I had left just a touch of purple showing in the recesses, I don't think that would have been such a bad thing. In either case, this is the tone we ended up with. So then I can next work on the eyes, which I'm going to start with a reddish pink, followed by the white of the sclera, then dot the center and draw the outlines of the iris with the smallest felt tip pen I could find, then fill in that outline with black. I then worked on the lashes, brows, and black lipstick, followed by some contouring for the cheeks and shadows for the eyes, before sealing the whole thing with a matte varnish and going back to the eyes. Why am I jumping back and forth rather than finishing the eyes in one go? To be honest, I don't really have a good reason other than I just felt like I wanted to see the cheeks shaded in to help me see where the face was going overall sooner rather than later. I did go with red eyes to match the cloak. To be honest, I was a little nervous that the cartoony color scheme wasn't going to translate well to a human character, so I wanted to sprinkle in some red to tie the color scheme together. Of course, the original Hornet had these big cartoony black eyes, and my interpretation of that on my human Hornet is some smoky war paint eyes. I really dig this. It's a little Tim Burton-y, maybe a little bit Corpse Bride-y, but I like the way it looks a lot. And I think it's conceivable that this version of Hornet would put on these war paint to create a more ghostly appearance when she's out doing her thing. Next is time for her hair, which means I need to mask off the face. The paint job itself is pretty straightforward. I start with the blue-gray base coat, highlighting slowly up to pure white over a few layers. The key here is to do it in two stages, the flattened hair and the pigtails, because I want there to be a clear progression from gray to white in each bundle of hair. And yes, peeling that tape off is really satisfying and really cool to see the reveal. Thankfully, no paint peeling drama this time. Her hair ties also get a little touch of red, same as the eyes. Again, I'm trying to tie the color scheme together with little details like this. After that, I shade the recesses with some pastel chalk just to give it some contrast. I felt like I might have gone a little bit overboard with white, to be honest. Finally, I jump back to the eyes one last time to give it a tiny little white glint. This adds a lot to the finished piece, and I'm so glad I took the time to go back and did this little detail. And that's the face and hair done, but we are not done quite yet because we have to work on the base. I'm first going to glue together some MDF, and it looks a little funny here because I want Hornet to be landing on a rock that's jutting out from the ground. I felt like the composition could use a little bit of lift instead of just a single toe landing on flat ground. So after the glue dried, I took this whole thing outside and carved and grind it down until it looked vaguely rock-shaped. Now, this isn't bad, but we can do better, and if there's anything that I've learned from north of the border, it's that the best way to make things look like rocks is by using rocks. I've covered up the MDF core with epoxy clay and I'm applying texture using a bunch of rocks of various types, trying to be careful to maintain some striations and shape in the texture. I didn't collect these, by the way, I just got them from Amazon. I guess there are people who collect various rocks and minerals or whatever, so I got these years ago thinking I wanted to use them for a project, but never did, and so I'm kinda happy I'm now finally able to make use of them. Once a rock is done, we're going to set it aside and make some shells. Shells are a recurring visual motif in Hollow Knight, and I want to include that here, except I want a lot of shells. Lots of shells. So I made 7 to start, then used some cosclay and cosclay separator juice to make molds and subsequent copies of said shells. To be honest, this didn't actually save me any time, because each cycle of filling the mold and then baking it is a few hours for the warm up and the cool down times in the oven, but at least I didn't have to manually make so many and I could spend my time waiting doing other things. And I learned a new technique, so who knows what else I can do with it in the future. So after several cycles, I have way too many shells. In reality, I made these before I made the base, and I thought I was going to use a bigger base, so yeah, what are you going to do, right? Back to the actual base, I mixed up some terrain paste, which is just some plaster, Mod Podge, paint, and sandy dirt. I then glooped that mixture onto the base, then stuck the shells on. Did you notice I also made some half shells specifically for this purpose? Well, I did. Anyway, once that terrain paste sets up, I dripped on some PVA glue mixed with isopropyl alcohol, then sprinkled on some more sandy dirt, and sealed it with more glue and alcohol to give the ground some texture. And once that's all dry, we can paint. But before we do, I'm going to drill a hole for the mounting peg into the rock itself. I've reinforced the peg with epoxy to make a trapezoidal shape so that she wouldn't spin. For the paint, I first coated everything black, no need to bother with a gray layer this time, then dry brushed the rock with a few layers of gray ending up at a near white. Then I dry brushed a couple of layers of brown onto the ground part of the base, followed by a couple of layers of washes, dark brown for the dirt, near black for the shells, followed by some really dry brushings of some grays on the dirt and the shells separately. I wanted to give the impression that these shells have been here for a very long time and have basically calcified and turned to stone. And that is it for the base, but we're still not quite done yet because the very last thing this piece needs is the quote-unquote silk threads to go into Hornet's sword. All I did was tie a stainless steel beading wire to the loop in the sword pommel and tried my best to coax the wire into making the shape that I want. Gluing down a couple small spots to the ground with some CA glue and accelerator helps a lot, and from there it was just a matter of being patient as I can while trying my best to keep the curves as smooth as I can. But with that, the sculpture is finally complete, and when you put it all back together, it looks a little something like this. And that is it, my human version of Hornet. I'm so happy with how this piece turned out, and I definitely learned a lot in the process of putting it together. Does this look like Hornet? Well, no, of course not. But it was still fun to adapt the character into human form, and I love it nonetheless. I hope you've enjoyed watching the process of this piece coming together, and if you did, won't you please consider supporting me on Patreon, where you can find an in-depth tutorial on how to get started sculpting yourself, and an even deeper discussion of the techniques, thought processes, and other trials and tribulations I went through that did not fit in this video. So with that, thank you for watching. I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.